بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين. I'll start by trying to encapsulate one of the books of the great master Ibn Arabi, that there are two Isras. The Isra, the ascension in the outer reality to the presence of the Absolute, and the ascension within, where these various components of the self arise to form the self and Tawheed. The two kingdoms mirror each other, and there is an inner kingdom which has its own ruler, and the ruler over the inner kingdom is the soul, that spark from the unseen which animates and gives reality to all other aspects of the self. So I think if we look at ourselves in terms of multiplicities, various kinds of selves, various kinds of identities, there's no doubt that we all have our own biography. We all have certain aspects of the self that rises and falls, and those of us, inshallah, on the path of inner and outer Tawheed will also try to understand these aspects of the self that constitutes the one. The more the self is in Tawheed, the more it nears the other occupant of this physical body of ours, which is the soul. So I call this the Muqaddimah, or the introduction. And it is not really a biography, it's just by way of an intellectual and spiritual biography. There are other aspects to myself which may be of greater or lesser interest, but I will not raise them here. I'll start by saying I was born into a mildly observant Muslim family in Iraq. And in the 1950s, in the Middle East and the broader Islamic world, it was a time when the secular elements of society, the ruling political and cultural elites, which I have to admit that we were part of that, we've moved far away from an overt identification with Islam. And it appeared then to be only a matter of time before Islam would lose whatever hold it may still have had on the peoples and societies of the Muslim world. And I think the term Muslim was not that much used even in the 1950s and 60s. People identified themselves more in terms of their nationality or ethnic status or ideological affinities. And again, if truth be told, the 1950s and 1960s in the Middle East, and this is true probably throughout the Islamic world, Islam was not really a factor in daily life. I mean, religion, we had to be taught religion in school, but the life around us was decoupling from the roots of the deen. We were taught the rules of prayer, and perhaps some of us fasted in Ramadan, but we were not really expected to do either. We learned the shorter verses of the Qur'an, but the book was kept mainly in drawers or on shelves, mostly unread. And the pilgrimage to Mecca was only for those of us who had aged and were atoning for their transgressions. So more like an insurance policy, I would say. And the term jihad itself, I don't think was ever used, at least it's in contemporary context those days. And the rhetoric in our part of the world was more to do with Arab destiny and anti-imperialism, and a bit of religious fervor popped up in the Suez Crisis of 1956. Those of you of that age will remember. And Cairo radio used to blare out all kinds of slogans calling on the assistance of Almighty against the Anglo-French Israeli invasion. But really that was about it. That was the effect of the outer forms of Islam on our daily life. Women, I might add, in that period, certainly the middle classes and the upper middle classes, did not wear hijab. It was highly unusual to find people wearing anything but Western clothes in that period. And the only connection I had with the past was my late grandfather, a merchant of the old school, who used to still wear the turbans and robes of an old line merchant. I'm from a a Shia background, so we were expected to abide by the rights of Muharram. But for those of us, again, of a certain part of the system, we're not expected to participate. The kind of fervor that you see these days was not really tolerated, and it was seen to be something too ecstatic for polite society. Tears were ritually shed. We had readers, reciters come to our house, recite the passion of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and tears were ritually shed, and after a short catharsis, things went back to normal. And modernity, in the way that Professor Lawrence was talking about, it was flooding everywhere, and people seemed to want more of it. Cinemas, snack bars, cabarets and country clubs, freely flowing alcohol and mixed parties. And I think Baghdad, which I'm referring to, is turning more into Babylon, the biblical Babylon. And I think if you read memoirs of the time from people from Tehran or Jakarta or Karachi or Casablanca, it really wasn't much different. 1950s, 1960s was a period when secularism basically and modernity had the Muslim world by the throat. And Islam provided some kind of ethical format for your daily life. But I think even that became very frayed as people moved into urban environments. When I first left Iraq, and I was a teenager then, I was far more secularist than religious in the traditional sense, but I still had something in the back. I mean, I'll get back, if we have time, I'll get to it later. That echo that you hear, that resonates with you when you hear the adhan, that never left me. I remember my earliest memories was around 4 years old when the Queen Mother, Queen Alia of Iraq, had died, and the government invited a famous reciter of the times, a man called Abu al-Aynain al-Sha'sha'i. I was about 4 or 5 years old then. This was 1952. And on the radio, I just heard this man recite Surat al-Inshiqaq. And I just couldn't get it out of I still can't get it out of my mind. And that resonance, that echo, that there is a reality beyond this here and now, was the one that I took with me to England without necessarily encapsulating it in any kind of religious superstructure. And modernity seemed to be far more interesting, frankly, than this calcified Islam that seems to be on its way out. And those of you who are academically inclined, there was a book published in that period called The Passing of Traditional Society. And it was to do mainly with the retreat and like the Cheshire Cat, retreat of Islam from the Middle East. Now, whatever interest in religion I may have had in England, it was really ground out of me by my experiences of religion and religiosity in a minor English public school. So we had to go to all kinds of chapels, and the tedium of listening to really infinite formulaic sermons, I mean, that really destroyed whatever interest I may have had in organized religion, or at least the late Victorian version of it that was practiced in these minor public schools. But the seeds of my engagement with Islam, re-engagement with Islam, was also sown there. And I know that I used to instinctively react against any slight against Islam in the syllabus of the books of the times. And if anybody picks up the books that were taught in major Western countries in the 1950s and 60s, you could probably throw the authors in jail now for anti-racism and for the kind of easy slights and insults that they had about marauding Saracens versus brave crusaders. And the Indian Mutiny is described as a bloodthirsty rebellion and so on and so forth. I mean, I must admit, no one tried to convert me, but mainly I think because the headmaster of our school, who was a reverend, himself was going through a kind of spiritual crisis himself, and he ended up by hanging himself in the school, I'm afraid. But anyway, there were other Muslims in the school, mainly from Britain's shrinking empire. But I think they were not much different from me. They came mainly from Asian communities in Africa. A lot of them were of Indian origin, from Tanzania and Kenya and so on. But I think they all came from relatively the same type of secularized background. And I think our presence in England itself was a kind of affirmation that modernity and the future lay in the West. And the future was there. And frankly, the more West you were, the better off you were. And I spent the last years of my time in school in England trying to get out to America, which I succeeded. So I ended up in MIT in 1964, right at the beginning of the great cultural revolutions that both Sheikh Saadi and to some extent Sheikh Kabir talked about. These were the great cultural revolutions of the 1960s. I think it would have been impossible for any person at the time not to have been swept away, even if you're an outsider like me. I mean, I was not an American. But I had there was a certain cachet to being young those days, mainly because of the baby boom. And we were all sort of participating in this great global baby boom. And all the defining events of the time, teach-ins, sit-ins, civil rights movements, something called the Vietnam moratorium. It's surprising how similar experiences we all had. But in America, it was really the struggle for black empowerment that reawakened in me the possibility of a spiritually charged movement that is able to affect great transformations in public life. Of course, Martin Luther King himself was a churchman, but not the type that I had met in England. He's a different kind of person. And of course, Malcolm X, again, the radical black leader, had been a practicing Muslim in the year before his assassination. So I began to pay a bit more attention to the potential in Islam as a force for inner and outer renewal. So the 1970s, where I spent mainly in Washington, I was working then for the World Bank. After I left MIT, I went to Harvard and then to the World Bank. And then, so I was still engaged in this sort of search for a meaningful ethic to fill the void that was one of the consequences of this cultural revolution that we all experienced. I think a great number of young people were also trying to find an inner balance to the excesses of the counterculture. But I think in my case, I was far more reticent or sober about following the many fashionable gurus of the time, or attaching myself to any of these sort of self-awareness movements that were cropping up everywhere. I tried to find some Sufi orders that were anchored in the Islamic tradition, but that was a very difficult task, frankly, in Washington of the 1970s. But really, there's no chance in this world, but by this congruence of inner and outer forces. I was in London in 1976 when I came across something called the World of Islam Festival. I'm sure very few people have heard of it. But in its time, it was really a very, very powerful cultural and intellectual event. It was organized in London and took over the city. The entire city was, in fact, the entire southeast of England was handed over to the celebration and reflections on Islamic tradition and civilization. And if you compare Britain those days, it was mired in hyperinflation, and the British economy was on its back because of labor strife and constant strikes and changes of government and so on. It was quite an interesting juxtaposition between this celebration of this civilization and between the realities of this disintegrating economy. And this festival, it was organized by a man called Paul Keeler. And it was he was an eclectic Englishman, and I don't know if he's still with us, but he was a convert to Islam. But behind the whole edifice, as it were, was, I think, one of the great minds and the great spirits and one of Islam's great unsung heroes of modern times, the Raja of Mahmudabad. He was one of the greatest figures who had a very profound effect on me in that period. A bit of background about him. Muhammad Amir Ahmed Khan, we used to call him Raja Saab, and nearly everybody did. He died in 1973 before this festival. But I had befriended one of his relatives, who then introduced me to Raja Saab in London. And I had spent some time in London at the LSE, London School of Economics, in 1968. And through his relative, we used to go quite a lot to visit the Raja. He was then the director of the Regent's Park Mosque, which is the main Islamic center in London. And he had moved to London in 1967 for the second time from Pakistan, a country which owed really a great deal to the Raja. He was a long-time treasurer of the All India Muslim League, which was led by Pakistan's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And the League had pushed for the establishment of Pakistan as the homeland for the Muslims of India. The Raja himself was an heir to a vast fortune, which he expended nearly entirely on the cause of the Muslims of India. But as in many cases, he could not adjust to the lethal politics of Pakistan and left. And he took issue with what was happening to the country and left for England. But from the Raja, I picked up, or was inculcated into me, the essential linkage between ethics and politics, the necessity to integrate or to weave ethical considerations into political actions. He himself was a deeply idealistic and egalitarian person. And his Islam was entirely connected to the virtues of the deen, the fadail, and good works. He was a Raja, which is like a prince, but he performed manual labor and used to walk around wearing coarse homespun cloth, and always barefooted. And he could somehow combine this deep loyalty to Islam with a pronounced radical, even revolutionary bent. And the Raja himself was a frequent visitor to the shrines of the Imams in Iraq. And from him, I rekindled my involvement with and engagement with Imam Ali alayhi salam and Nahj al-Balagha. I cannot speak about Imam Ali without a great deal of emotion, so I won't. Suffice it to say that he is the virtues of Islam. The Prophet ﷺ was the Qur'an walking. Imam Ali was the virtues of Islam walking. Anyway, that was the effect of my involvement with the Raja. But the World of Islam Festival itself had another effect on me. And that is, this entire 3-4 months affair was organized by a group which I didn't know about then, but they were then called the traditionalists. People associated one way or the other with the teachings of René Guénon, the French metaphysician who then converted to Islam and was known as Sheikh Abdul Wahid Yahya. I don't want to go into perennialist thinking or traditionalist thinking, but it opened to me the inner dimensions of Islam. That Islam was not just a series of rituals and a series of requirements and decrees and styles of conduct, but had an inner reality that was central to one's self-knowledge. And in that festival, which was a point of criticism, I might add, for many people, because it was so dominated by this perspective. From my narrow point of view, it opened up the inner world of Islam. And some really seminal books were produced then. Books like Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book on Islamic science, Titus Burkhart's book on the art of Islam, and so on. And it was really a remarkable occurrence. From the traditionalists, I learned one major insight. Not that all religions have a common root. I mean, this is not really a great insight. This has been said before, during, and after many times in different ways. But René Ganon's main contribution, at least to my intellectual and hopefully spiritual development, is the idea of inversion. That modernity has inverted virtues into their opposites. And we think of the opposites now as being the defining features of what virtues are. And I can go on giving you many examples. I'll give you a few. How the essence of virtues has been inverted. Courage has become, modernity has turned it into a calculation and the idea of survival of the fittest. Nobility is turned into vulgarity and what is commonplace. Justice is inverted into legality and technicalities. Compassion, charity, is inverted into confiscation and status redistribution. Chivalry or futuwa is turned into worshipping of football heroes and musicians and rock stars and things like that. Beauty is turned into ugliness. You can be surprised how ugliness has become a mark of beauty, not in the West, in the world. Quality turns into quantity. Subtlety becomes grossness. Just look at the acts that you see on media, how grossness becomes the new subtlety, as it were. The freedom of La ilaha illallah, the bowing to the one that gives you total inner freedom, is replaced by servitude to special interests. So, but the equation of modernity is the abandonment or inversion of virtues in exchange for prosperity or the promise of prosperity. And that has won. Now, the increasing turmoil in Lebanon in the late 70s, to which I had relocated, sent me back to London in 1978. And there, with my revived interest in Islamic spirituality, I began to frequent the antiquarian and Orientalist booksellers near the British Museum. Most of these stores have long since closed, but one in particular stood out, and it's called Luzak and Company. And these people carried a broad range of literature on Oriental religions, Islam, and mysticism. And they had the original translations into English of some of the great foundational works of Sufism, especially Persian Sufism, which I could not access in its Persian form. Luzak was then owned by an Englishman, a kind of tweedy fellow, with a Japanese wife, if I remember. And most of the books that they published, as I said, dealt with Sufism, translated by classical works, translated by I call them the great Orientalists, because that's what they were, people like Nicholson and Arbery and so on. And they also published the first full-fledged translation of the Mathnawi of Jalaluddin Rumi by Reynold Nicholson. But frankly, I couldn't get through it, because apparently I found out later it was designed for Persian language students. So all the brackets you have to read the brackets too, and it became very difficult for me. But I picked up the other great poet who had, I must admit, a much greater influence on me, and that's Fariduddin Attar and his Mantaq al-Tayr. And that opened to me the entire vista of spirituality embodied in Persian mystical poetry, in translation, in spite of what I said yesterday. And of course, the great mystical Arab poets like Ibn al-Farid, who in many ways ranks with the greatest of those who have insights, especially who follow the Akbarian school. But again, I found something else in Luzak that period, which is a very slim volume by a certain Fadlal al-Hayri. And that brought me on another path. But I knew before in the late 70s that I needed somebody, that this was becoming too much for me to manage on my own, in my own solitary. Each one has a male, has a predilection, and some people have a predilection towards companionship, and many people, mine, I must admit, is more towards the few and the solitary. But I knew that I had to find somebody, a guide as it were, an accomplished person, a realized person, who can bring me along to the next step. Now, it was a chance remark by my grandmother that set me on this quest. She had mentioned that a certain Fadlal al-Hayri, from a well-known family in Karbala, in Iraq, had abandoned Islam and joined a guru in an ashram in the Himalayas. I hope Sheikh doesn't mind me. With your permission, Sheikh. She told the story with a mixture of incredulity and bemusement. The story was garbled, but it stuck in my mind. I had met briefly Sheikh Fadlallah. He was then known as Fadlallah al-Hayri, in Sharjah in 1975. I don't know if you remember, Sheikh, but where he had embarked on obviously a highly successful business career in the oil industry. And the idea that a scion of one of Iraq's most noted clerical families and a wealthy oil entrepreneur to boot would simply pack up and join an ashram sounded outlandish. But I must have filed the story somewhere. And it was while rummaging in these bookstores that I came across a slim volume of writings by none other than Fadlal al-Hayri. And it immediately triggered in my mind my grandmother's story about the runaway oil man. But it was really nothing more, this slim book, was nothing more than a series of talks that Sheikh Fadlallah had given in Pakistan. But the sincerity, passion, and wonder of an enlightened being shone through. I mean, it had if you read it, it's an interesting journey. But in that particular circumstances, in that particular condition, in Allah's lutf, don't forget there was the clarion call of the Iranian Revolution, which was another defining moment in our lives. It came through. The wonder of this enlightened being shone through in these 3 or 4 page journal notes, actually. That's what they were. I tried to track the person down, but I discovered that he had left for the United States. We had founded a retreat of sorts in the Texas Hill Country. However, after a chance meeting with a person that knew both of us, I discovered that he was now in London. And in fact, all this time, he was 200 yards across Hyde Park from my office. And this was in the summer of 1982, or 83. And at that point, I was already back into my Islamic practices, and we were fasting. That was the month of Ramadan, the summer of 1983, and the days were interminably long. The fast ended around 9:30. After work, which is maybe 6:30, I used to amble across Hyde Park and visit the Sheikh at his center, the other side of Hyde Park in London, in Ossington Street. And it was really there that the other turning point in my spiritual biography, if you want to call it that, occurred. And that's where there were not many people there who, during the fasting hours. So I had basically the Sheikh to myself for quite a few times. And at that point, there was a commitment made that this is the guide that one needs if one is to have, not to keep on stumbling and reinventing the wheel on this spiritual path. Of course, a number of the stories I heard were true about him. I mean, he did leave. He did go to India with Swami Chinmaya. But he did not become anything that he wasn't. And in fact, all of these events are related in Sheikh's book, his wonderful book called The Son of Karbala, where he unfolds his spiritual autobiography. But this encounter with Sheikh Fadlallah, which has been going on now for more than nearly 3 decades, it set me on this lifelong path to trying to understand and experience the inner dimensions of Islam. And whenever I could, throughout the 80s and 90s I had much more time on my hand because I had sold my business. And we used to travel really on spiritual odysseys, I call them, with his close murids, his close friends, to South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, various European countries, Pakistan, India. And this has, of course, continued, alhamdulillah, into the present time. The other aspects of my biography, which are mainly political, I will not talk about. But I just want to, if I have the time, to just draw some lessons that may be useful to all of you from my own exposure. There are 5, in terms of intellectual development, I think nobody has had a greater influence on me intellectually than 2 people. The writings of Plato and the writings of a British 19th century liberal philosopher called Lord Acton. Spiritually, though, the Qur'an and the Hadith and the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ are on a rank of their own. And there is no possibility of spiritual development, in my case, without recourse to these essential foundations. The second one is Imam Ali alayhi salam. And it has nothing to do with being Shia, believe me. It is nothing to do with having a long tradition of listening to and imbibing praise of the Imams. I'm speaking specifically of Imam Ali alayhi salam. If any of you has not read Nahj al-Balagha as a guideway and a pathway to ethical and virtuous action seen from the point of the man in Tawheed, then you have missed a great deal in your spiritual evolution. The third great influence on me, and continues to be, is the great master Ibn Arabi. And Ibn Arabi is yesterday I think we had from Professor Lawrence a kind of juxtaposition between a juxtaposition between Ibn Arabi and Rumi. And it's a question of taste and predilection. My pathway, each person, I believe, has a certain predilection, certain tendency, and this is part of their the universal self as it comes down into the individual, has a certain mail, has a certain angle, whereby the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as they are manifested in individuals as attributes, have different weightings and hierarchies. Some people are governed by one name more than the other. Those who are governed by names like Al-Wadud choose the path of love, of attraction, and to them Jalaluddin Rumi is a perfect guide into that world. Those whose predilection is towards hikmah, towards wisdom, towards knowledge, find more, I believe, in Ibn Arabi. That doesn't mean that this is better than that, or that person is superior than that. It is just a question of predilection, which it's known, it's a male. And Ibn Arabi, again, I hope to be able to write at some point a book about him, but it's such a magnificent spiritual architecture of the mind meeting the absolute. Not the heart meeting the absolute, the mind meeting the absolute. And it's come out in ways that are unsurpassed. Not everything that he has written, but the collectivity of what he has written is unsurpassed. It took me several years to understand Ibn Arabi, but he unfolded in a matter of hours, once I found the keys. And Sheikh Fadlallah played a very central part in identifying where to look for the keyhole so you can put the keys in. The fourth group are the poets of tasawwuf, and again the Persians have excelled in that, and at the peak I would put Fariddin Attar, because that's the one that has the greatest effect on me, and Mantaq al-Tayr, to the point where I was involved, in fact, in trying to do a verse play performance of that Mantaq al-Tayr. And here I'll just, in parenthesis, I think we have to say a good word about the Orientalists, those great 19th century and 20th century Islamists, Islamic scholars from the West, who saw this world in a different light. And they did, I think, a remarkable job. I said the first thing you have to establish in your spiritual path, using me as a kind of leitmotif, is the predilection. What is the nature of yourself? Which of the names prevail? Is it the name of generosity? Is it the name of anger? Is it the name of power? Is it the name of courage? Is it the name? What is it? Because you cannot go against it. What you can only do is balance it. If you have a predilection towards certain names of Allah that are in the hierarchy of names, not those, let's say, of mawadda, of love, or not those of beauty, but more of jalal, you have to manage them in ways that they don't go into their opposites. The second requirement, I think, of I won't say a successful spiritual journey, because it's successful anyway, just by starting it, is your, what we call in Arabic, your istidad, your preparedness. You have to be prepared to accept this knowledge that comes from realms that are not tangible, that are not sentient. The third requirement is dhawq, or taste. You have to have a taste for this knowledge. It's not for everybody. And even though you may like its outer form, its inner reality is different. Only you know whether you have the dhawq for that, or it's merely an emotional or intellectual engagement with it. The fourth thing you need is commitment. You have to be committed. And this is a path that never begins or ends, but you have to be committed to that path. And for that, I think, you unless you are one of those very, very few people, you must have a guide who is true and who has been tested, and it is not easy for one to choose a guide. And a guide that has gone through with you in various cycles and permutations. And then the journey can start. And all those manuals that you have, you have to be in Tawbah, then you have to be repentant, then you have to do this, then you have to do that, is really just technical terms. They only mean something if they reverberate with you. It's not because somebody experienced them before. And the journey starts, it doesn't end. It begins without ending, it ends without beginning. And the world, I think, your inner world becomes much more prepared to both witness the reality of the manifestations, or self-disclosure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'll close by just paraphrasing one of the great poets of Bilad Faris, of Iran, Abd al-Rahman Jami, who says, and excuse my translation, came from Persian to Arabic to English, so he says, how gracious Haqq is to give me flashes of reality. I had a dream the other day that all my dreams came true.